The New Orleans Municipal Archives contain a financial ledger that has never been adequately explained. Buried among thousands of routine transactions from the winter and spring of 1840, one series of entries defies every known principle of economics, human behavior, and possibility itself. Between January and May of that year, a single auction house on Chartres Street in the French Quarter recorded the sale of one woman 37 times, not 37 different women. The same individual woman. Each transaction documented with names, dates, and prices that climbed to heights no rational market could justify. Each buyer, a man of wealth and standing in New Orleans society. Each sale separated by exactly 11 days. The pattern holds perfect mathematical precision across 5 months, 11 days between every transaction without exception. No illness interrupted the sequence. No travel delays altered the rhythm. No external events disrupted the clockwork regularity of these impossible sales. And every single buyer paid more than the previous purchaser, as if competing in an auction that never ended, where the hammer fell again and again, and the merchandise returned like a tide that refused to stay gone. When the ledger was transferred to the Louisiana State Archives in 1898, a notation appeared in faded ink across the top of the relevant pages. Do not catalog, do not reference in finding aids. Restrict access pending review by the Governor's Historical Commission. That review never occurred. The pages remain sealed behind academic protocols that have calcified into absolute barriers. Researchers who stumble across references to this ledger in peripheral documents find their access requests denied without explanation. What happened in New Orleans during those 5 months? Why would the same woman be sold 37 times? And what convinced every buyer to part with her after exactly 11 days, only to watch her return to auction where other men fought desperately to purchase what their predecessors had surrendered? The answers exist in testimony that was never meant to survive, in private journals that families destroyed when their contents became too dangerous to preserve, in letters that were burned, and in one extraordinary manuscript written by a man who witnessed every transaction and spent the rest of his life trying to understand what he had documented. Before we descend into the darkness of what transpired on Chartres Street, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these buried chapters of American history. The sealed room exists to uncover the stories that institutions tried to erase, and please, leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. I love knowing that these forgotten truths are reaching people across different places and backgrounds. Now, let's examine what really happened in New Orleans in the winter of 1840. The city sprawled along the Mississippi River's crescent bend, its streets thick with humidity, even in January, when northern cities froze solid. New Orleans operated according to rules that differed from the rest of America. French and Spanish legal traditions mixed with American territorial law. Creole society maintained hierarchies that outsiders found impenetrable. And the slave trade functioned with a brutality that surpassed even Charleston or Richmond, processing human beings through a market system that reduced life to inventory with ruthless efficiency. The auction houses, clustered in the French Quarter, mostly along Chartres Street and nearby blocks where commerce flowed like the river itself. These establishments operated daily except Sundays, their business sustained by the endless demand for labor on sugar plantations upriver, cotton fields spreading across Louisiana's interior, and the vast domestic operations required by New Orleans' wealthiest families. Among these auction houses, one commanded particular respect from the city's elite. Maison Delacroix occupied a 3-story building with wrought iron balconies and thick walls that kept the interior cool even during summer's worst heat. The establishment had been founded in 1798 by Maison Delacroix, a French émigré who built his business through reputation for discretion and accuracy. By 1840, the house was managed by his grandson, Etienne Delacroix, a methodical man of 36 who maintained ledgers with accounting precision that made his records admissible in legal proceedings throughout Louisiana. Etienne had inherited his grandfather's obsession with documentation. Every sale was recorded with comprehensive detail. Physical descriptions, ages, skills, prices, buyer information, seller credentials, dates, times, witnesses. His ledgers became reference documents for estate settlements, bankruptcy proceedings, and inheritance disputes. Judges trusted his records absolutely because in 15 years of managing Maison Delacroix, not one of his documented transactions had ever been successfully challenged in court. He employed 6 clerks who verified documentation before sales, inspected merchandise for accuracy of claimed abilities, and ensured every transaction complied with Louisiana's complex legal requirements regarding slave sales. The clerks worked under Etienne's direct supervision, and all of them understood that their professional reputations depended on maintaining the absolute accuracy that made Maison Delacroix the most prestigious auction house in the city. January 7th, 1840. Arrived with morning fog rolling off the Mississippi, thick enough to muffle sound and reduce visibility to a few feet. Etienne arrived at his office before dawn, as was his habit, reviewing the day's scheduled sales and confirming that all documentation was prepared. The morning promised to be routine. 3 estate sales involving household staff, 1 consignment of field workers from a Baton Rouge plantation, and several individual sales from owners who no longer required particular slaves' services. Shortly after the auction house opened, a man Etienne had never encountered before entered carrying papers and leading a woman whose appearance immediately commanded attention. The man identified himself as Christophe Laveau, representing interests in Natchez. He spoke French with an accent Etienne couldn't quite place, something that suggested European education, but with strange intonations that didn't match any region Etienne knew. Laveau's clothing was expensive but oddly styled, as if he'd dressed in garments from different decades without awareness that fashions had changed. The woman stood with a bearing that suggested she'd never been enslaved. Her posture was too confident, her gaze too direct. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with features that could have been French, Spanish, African, or some combination that defied easy categorization. New Orleans was accustomed to complex ancestry, but something about her seemed to exist outside the usual categories the city imposed on people. Laveau placed papers on Etienne's desk. She had belonged to an estate in Natchez that dissolved following her owner's death without heirs. The documentation appeared legitimate, properly notarized, with seals Etienne recognized from Mississippi territorial records. He examined the papers carefully and found nothing irregular. "What is her name?" Etienne asked. "Marguerite," Laveau replied. "Skills and abilities?" Fluent in French, English, Spanish, and several African languages Etienne had never heard of. Educated in literature, mathematics, and music. Experienced in household management, skilled in medicinal preparation and midwifery, literate in 4 languages. Etienne looked up from the papers. "These qualifications are extraordinary." "She was owned by a wealthy planter who valued education," Laveau said calmly. "He invested considerably in her training. And now she is being sold because the estate must be liquidated. There are no heirs. Everything must be converted to currency for distribution according to Mississippi law." Etienne accepted this explanation because it aligned with procedures he understood. He recorded her details in his ledger with customary thoroughness. Approximately 28 years of age, female, skills as stated, notable features including unusual eyes that seemed to shift color depending on light, and a distinctive mark on her right wrist, 3 small scars, forming a pattern that looked deliberately created. He assigned her inventory number 4112 and scheduled her for that afternoon's auction. The sale would proceed after the estate lots were completed, giving prominent buyers time to inspect her and assess her claimed abilities. Word spread quickly through the French Quarter that Maison de Laqua was offering someone exceptional. By early afternoon, the auction house had filled with planters and merchants who normally sent agents to handle purchases. Etienne recognized faces he'd never seen at actual auctions. Men whose wealth was so vast they didn't involve themselves in routine business. The Livaudet family, who controlled sugar plantations spanning thousands of acres. The Marquis de Boré, whose innovations in sugar processing had made him one of Louisiana's richest men. Alexandre Lebranche, whose banking operations financed half the commerce flowing through New Orleans. The bidding began at $500, already 3 times the typical price for even highly skilled slaves. Within minutes, it reached $2,000. Etienne watched carefully, noting the intensity with which these men competed. They weren't calculating potential profit or productivity. They were driven by something else, some need to possess this particular woman that transcended economic logic. When the hammer finally fell, Jean-Baptiste Lebranche, one of Alexandre's cousins and owner of multiple plantations along the river road, had paid $6,200. The sum represented more than many skilled craftsmen earned in a decade. It exceeded the price of prime field hands by factors of 10 or 12. Etienne documented the sale precisely: buyer's name, price, date, time, witnesses. Lebranche signed the paperwork and arranged for Marguerite's transport to his plantation that evening. He departed with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd acquired something truly valuable. 11 days later, on January 18th, Christophe Lavaux returned to Maison Delacroix. He was leading the same woman. He carried fresh papers documenting his authority to sell her on behalf of Jean-Baptiste Lebranche. Etienne's professional composure, maintained through thousands of transactions over 15 years, fractured completely. Monsieur Lavaux, I personally witnessed Monsieur Lebranche purchase this woman less than 2 weeks ago. He paid more than $6,000. The transaction is documented in my ledgers with complete accuracy. Lavaux's expression remained neutral. Monsieur Lebranche has decided she does not suit his requirements. He has authorized her resale. All documentation is properly executed. Etienne examined the papers. Lebranche's signature appeared authentic. The legal language was correct. A notary seal he recognized confirmed the authorization. Slaves were property, and property could be sold repeatedly if owners chose. No law prohibited this, yet every instinct Etienne had developed through 15 years in this business screamed that something was profoundly wrong. Monsieur Lebranche paid an extraordinary sum, Etienne said carefully. It seems impossible that he would make such an error in judgment about her suitability. Nevertheless, Lavaux placed additional papers on the desk. Here is his written statement explaining his decision. You'll find it properly notarized. Etienne read the statement. The language was formal but vague. After careful consideration, I have determined that the acquisition does not meet the specific requirements of my household operations. I authorize her immediate resale through whatever channels Monsieur Lavaux deems appropriate. The phrasing felt rehearsed, as if Lebranche had been instructed what to write, but the signature was legitimate and the notarization valid. Etienne accepted the consignment because refusing would require explaining suspicions he couldn't articulate based on evidence he didn't possess. The second auction occurred on January 21st. This time, bidding opened at $3,000 and climbed even more rapidly. Etienne noticed that Jean-Baptiste Lebranche was not present, though several other Lebranche family members bid aggressively. Ultimately, Dominique, a former associate of the pirate Jean Lafitte, who had parlayed his war heroism into respectability and wealth, purchased Marguerite for $7,800. Exactly 11 days later, on February 1st, Christophe Lavaux returned with Marguerite and papers authorizing resale on behalf of Dominique U. By the fourth sale, patterns had emerged that Etienne documented with increasing alarm. Every buyer was a man of significant wealth and social standing. Every transaction occurred exactly 11 days after the previous sale. Every price exceeded what the buyer before had paid. And every authorization for resale used nearly identical language about unsuitability for the buyer's requirements. Etienne began adding private notations in a separate journal he kept locked in his desk drawer. The buyers are not behaving rationally. They compete with desperation that transcends economic calculation. Men who built vast fortunes through shrewd judgment are abandoning all restraint. Something is compelling them to purchase her regardless of cost, and then something is forcing them to surrender her after exactly 11 days. The precision of the timing cannot be coincidental. What Etienne couldn't document in his official ledgers was what he began hearing through New Orleans' intricate social networks. The whispers that spread through French Quarter cafes, the hushed conversations at the street, Louis Cathedral after Mass, the rumors that circulated through banking houses and law offices. Jean-Baptiste Lebranche had withdrawn from society entirely. His wife had moved to their city residence, refusing to return to the plantation. Dominique Yu, a man famous for his courage under fire during the Battle of New Orleans, now refused to leave his house after dark and had dismissed most of his household staff. The third buyer, Céleste Marinier, from one of the city's oldest Creole families, had sold property to cover mysterious debts that shouldn't have existed given his family's wealth. The prices continued climbing with mathematical precision. By the 10th sale in mid-March, Marguerite sold for $14,000 to Bernard Marigny, whose family had subdivided their plantation to create the Faubourg Marigny neighborhood. 11 days later, she was back at Maison Delacroix. Etienne hired an investigator, a former constable named Jacques Reynaud, who now conducted discreet inquiries for attorneys and businessmen. "I need to understand what happens after each sale," Etienne told him. "Contact the buyers if possible. Learn why they're reselling her. Find out anything you can about their experiences during those 11 days." Reynaud worked for 2 weeks, traveling to plantations, speaking with overseers and household staff, occasionally questioning the buyers themselves under various pretexts. What he reported back confirmed Etienne's worst suspicions that something impossible was occurring. "Not one of them keeps her longer than 11 days exactly," Reynaud said, spreading his notes across Etienne's desk after hours. "Most don't even wait that long to begin the resale process. They contact Laveau within days of the purchase, but the transaction doesn't complete until day 11. I spoke with Dominique Yu's housekeeper, a woman who's been with his household for 30 years. She said, 'Monsieur, you spent hours locked in his study with Marguerite. She could hear conversation through the door, not arguments, not raised voices, just talking, hour after hour after hour. When Monsieur Yu finally emerged, he looked, in her words, like he'd aged 20 years overnight.' Did he explain what they discussed?" Etienne asked. "He wouldn't speak of it, but the housekeeper said he burned papers in his fireplace that night. Letters, documents, things he'd kept for decades. She saw him weeping as he fed them to the flames. And the others? Similar accounts. Céleste Marinier locked himself in his library with her for 2 full days. Servants left food outside the door. When he finally came out, he'd made arrangements to free 6 of his slaves, specific individuals he'd owned for years. Then he immediately authorized her resale. Bernard Marigny dismissed his overseer, the man who'd managed his operations for 15 years. Just sent him away with a year's wages and no explanation. Reynaud continued his investigations, and each report deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. "There's something else," the investigator said during their next meeting. "I tried to trace Christophe Laveau's background. Can't find any record of him operating in Natchez or anywhere else in Mississippi before January. No business registration, no property holdings, no family connections. It's as if he materialized specifically to handle these sales." "Have you tried following him between transactions?" Etienne asked. "He stays at a boarding house on Dauphine Street, but I've watched the place for days and never seen him enter or leave except when he's bringing her to your auction house. The landlady says he pays months in advance, keeps entirely to himself, and she rarely sees him. Yet somehow he's always present exactly when another sale is scheduled." Etienne stared at his ledgers with their meticulous documentation of impossible events. "What about Marguerite herself? Did you learn anything about what she does during those 11 days? Reynaud's expression grew troubled. That's where things become truly strange. She doesn't work, not in any conventional sense. The buyers don't put her in the fields or assign her household duties. They keep her in their private quarters, libraries, studies, personal rooms, and they talk with her for hours, sometimes entire nights. Servants hear voices through doors but can't make out words. And when those conversations end, the buyers are fundamentally changed. Changed how? Their certainties are gone. Men who defended slavery as God's natural order suddenly question everything. Men who built fortunes through brutal efficiency suddenly can't bear to give orders to their own slaves. Dominique, you freed 12 people after those 11 days, not sold them, freed them with papers and passage money north. A man who'd owned slaves his entire adult life suddenly couldn't tolerate ownership anymore. By the 15th sale in early April, Etienne had begun to feel physical dread each time Lavaux appeared at Maison Delacroix. The transactions had taken on a nightmarish quality, repeating with clockwork precision, while New Orleans society pretended not to notice the impossible pattern consuming its wealthiest men. The auction house itself had changed. Other sellers began avoiding Maison Delacroix on days when Marguerite was scheduled for sale. Regular buyers who attended auctions weekly suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Only those compelled by whatever dark fascination drove them to compete for her appeared on those days, and the atmosphere in the room felt charged with something Etienne couldn't name. Not excitement, something darker, dread mixed with compulsion. Etienne noticed changes in the buyers before they purchased her. They arrived at the auction house looking confident, certain of their wealth and status. But once bidding began, something shifted in their expressions. The confidence became desperation. They bid against each other with an intensity that suggested they were competing for something far more significant than valuable property. As if acquiring her represented a test they needed to pass, proof of their power and control. And then, 11 days later, they returned her broken. The word wasn't quite right, but Etienne couldn't find better language. The buyers weren't physically harmed. They walked, talked, conducted business, but something essential in them had been destroyed. Their certainty about their place in the world, their comfortable participation in systems that had enriched them, their ability to ignore the human cost of their wealth. All of it shattered during those 11 days. Pierre Soulet purchased her on April 9th for $21,000. Soulet was a prominent attorney and politician, a man whose legal arguments had defended slaveholders' rights in courts throughout Louisiana. He was known for his intellectual brilliance, his command of legal philosophy, his ability to construct arguments that made slavery seem not just economically necessary, but morally justified. 11 days later, when Lavaux brought Marguerite back to Maison Delacroix, Renaud managed to speak briefly with Soulet's law clerk, a young man who'd worked for the attorney for 3 years. "Monsieur Soulet hasn't slept since the second night," the clerk said quietly. Glancing around to ensure no one overheard, he sits in his office with all his legal texts spread across his desk. Cases, he's argued, briefs he's written, published articles defending our institutions. And he's marking through them with red ink, writing notes in the margins, things like sophistry, moral cowardice, elaborate justification for evil. He's dismantling his own life's work. "What did she say to him?" Renaud asked. "I don't know exactly, but I heard her voice once through the door. She was asking him questions, not arguing, not accusing, just asking questions in a calm voice. Questions like, if enslaved people can learn law, philosophy, and science, as you've acknowledged they can, what principle justifies treating them as property? And, if you would consider it evil for someone to enslave your children based solely on their ancestry, why is it not evil when you do the same to others?" She wasn't giving speeches. She was forcing him to confront the logical contradictions in positions he's defended his entire career. By the 20th sale in late April, whispers had spread throughout New Orleans that something was deeply wrong at Maison de Laqua. Respectable families began warning their men to avoid those particular auctions. Mothers cautioned sons. Wives urged husbands to stay away. But the warnings only seemed to increase the compulsion for certain men to attend. Etienne recognized the psychology. The warnings transformed the auctions into tests of courage and will. Men who considered themselves strong, rational, and in control believed they would be different from previous buyers. They thought whatever had broken other men wouldn't break them. Their arrogance made them perfect targets for whatever education Marguerite provided during those 11 days. The prices climbed beyond any rational relationship to human value. $25,000, $30,000, $35,000. Sums that represented entire plantations, lifetime accumulations of wealth, fortunes that could support families for generations. Men were bankrupting themselves for 11 days of ownership and then surrendering her at devastating financial losses. Etienne's own obsession grew alongside the prices. He couldn't stop thinking about the pattern, couldn't stop trying to understand what was happening. His wife noticed his distraction, his inability to focus on anything except those ledgers with their impossible documentation. "You're letting this consume you," Margot said one evening as Etienne sat at their dining table, barely touching his food, his mind elsewhere. "Whatever is happening with those sales isn't your responsibility. You're just documenting transactions. You're not causing this." "But I am causing it," Etienne replied. "Every time I accept her back for resale, I'm enabling the pattern to continue. I could refuse. I could tell Laveau that Maison Delacroix will no longer handle these transactions. And what would that accomplish? Another auction house would take the business. You'd lose your reputation for never refusing legitimate sales. Your competitors would benefit from your principles." She was right, and Etienne knew it. The system was larger than his individual choices. Refusing to participate wouldn't stop what was happening. It would just transfer the transactions elsewhere while damaging the business his grandfather had built. This reasoning sounded familiar to Etienne, uncomfortably so. It was the same logic he'd used for 15 years to justify his work. He was just the auctioneer. He didn't own plantations. He didn't work slaves in fields. He simply facilitated transactions between willing parties. He was a professional, providing a service that someone would provide, whether he did or not. The realization made him feel sick. By the 25th sale in early May, Etienne had begun having nightmares. He dreamed of endless ledgers where every entry bled into the next, names and prices and dates becoming incomprehensible. He dreamed of auction blocks that stretched into infinity, with Marguerite standing on each one, her expression never changing, her eyes seeming to see directly through whatever comfortable lies he told himself about his profession. He started making mistakes in his work, small errors that his clerks caught before they became serious problems. A price recorded incorrectly, a buyer's name misspelled, a date transposed. These were errors Etienne hadn't made in 15 years. Mistakes that threatened the reputation for accuracy that made Maison Delacroix trusted by Louisiana's courts and elite families. Jacques Renaud continued providing reports, though the investigator himself had become visibly troubled by what he was learning. "I spoke with Auguste Leroy's body servant," Renaud said during their last meeting in late April. "Leroy purchased her on the 22nd sale. His servant, a man named Vincent, who's been with the Leroy family since Auguste was born, told me something extraordinary. He said Marguerite spent those 11 days asking Monsieur Leroy to tell her stories about specific slaves he'd owned. She knew their names. People who'd been sold years ago, people who'd died, people who'd run away. She knew details about their lives that existed in no records, and she asked Monsieur Leroy to remember them. Not as property, not as investments or losses on his ledgers, but as actual human beings with thoughts and feelings and families. Vincent said his master wept for 3 days straight. How could she know those things? Etienne asked. How could she have information that doesn't exist in any documentation? I don't know, Renaud admitted. I've searched every record I can access. Manifests from slave ships, estate inventories, auction house ledgers including your own. There's no trace of her before she appeared with Laveau in January. It's as if she has no past, or as if her past is deliberately impossible to discover. "What is she?" Etienne asked quietly. Renaud was silent for a long moment. "I was a constable for 18 years. I investigated murders, fraud, conspiracy. I believed in rational explanations for everything. But this," he gestured at the notes spread across Etienne's desk, "defies rational explanation. She's either exactly what she appears to be, an extraordinarily educated woman who somehow knows impossible things, or she's something else entirely. Something that exists outside the categories we use to understand the world." The 28th sale occurred on May 5th. Etienne recognized the buyer immediately. Valcourt Aimé, known throughout Louisiana as the wealthiest planter in the state. His Le Petit Versailles plantation was legendary, an estate so vast and lavish that foreign dignitaries visited to marvel at its gardens, architecture, and the brutal efficiency of its sugar production. Aimé had pioneered innovations in sugar processing that increased productivity dramatically while requiring slaves to work under conditions that killed them at rates higher than almost any other Louisiana plantation. Aimé paid $43,000 for Marguerite. The sum exceeded the value of most plantations. It represented wealth accumulated over generations, concentrated into a single transaction for 11 days of ownership. Etienne watched him sign the paperwork and felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. The pattern was building toward something specific. Each buyer had represented a different aspect of slavery's operation. Planters, merchants, bankers, attorneys who provided legal justifications. And now Valcourt Aimé, the man who embodied the system's ultimate expression, vast wealth built through innovative cruelty, where human beings were processed like crops, their lives calculated in terms of sugar production per season, their deaths factored into business planning as acceptable losses. When Christophe Laveau returned 11 days later with authorization for resale, Etienne noticed something different. The factor's usual impassive expression had shifted slightly, something that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps anticipation. "Monsieur Aimé found her unsuitable?" Etienne asked, already knowing the answer. "Profoundly unsuitable," Laveau replied. "He has authorized immediate resale with no minimum price requirement." Etienne examined the papers. Aimé's signature was barely legible, the letters shaking and uneven. Additional notes filled the margins of the authorization. Calculations crossed out, numbers that seemed to represent attempts at quantifying something that couldn't be quantified. And one phrase, repeated 3 times in increasingly desperate handwriting, 2,417 names. "What does this mean?" Etienne asked, pointing to the notation. Laveau's expression remained neutral. "I believe that's how many people Monsieur Aimé calculated have died on his plantation over the 30 years he's owned it." Marguerite asked him to name them. All of them. He couldn't, of course. He'd kept detailed records of their deaths in his ledgers. Cause of death, date, estimated age, but never their names, just numbers in his accounting books. She made him understand what that meant, what it means to own human beings and track their deaths like crop losses. The 29th sale was scheduled for May 19th. Etienne prepared the documentation with hands that trembled despite his efforts to control them. He knew the pattern was approaching its conclusion. 29 sales across nearly 5 months. The precision of the 11-day intervals, the escalating prices now approaching $50,000. The systematic destruction of New Orleans' wealthiest and most powerful men. And he knew, with dread that made him feel physically ill, that the pattern would soon reach him personally. The auction house filled that morning with the usual crowd of observers and compelled buyers. But Etienne noticed Christophe Laveau standing at the back of the room, watching not Marguerite on the auction block, but Etienne himself. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and Laveau smiled slightly, an expression of acknowledgement, as if they both understood what was coming. The bidding opened at $25,000 and climbed rapidly. Men who'd attended previous auctions competed with renewed desperation, as if this might be their last chance to acquire something they needed, despite not understanding why they needed it. When the hammer finally fell, Narcisse Brutin, a sugar factor whose business connected plantations with international markets, had paid $51,000. It was the highest price ever documented in Louisiana for a single slave, higher than legendary skilled craftsmen who could build entire buildings, higher than nurses who saved lives through medical knowledge, higher than anyone whose value might be calculated through actual productive capacity. As Brutin signed the paperwork, Etienne watched Marguerite and saw her looking directly at him. Her expression held no emotion, but her gaze seemed to penetrate through every comfortable justification he'd constructed around his work. She knew. Whatever she was, wherever she'd come from, she knew that the pattern would eventually reach him. And that knowledge filled him with terror, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. 11 days passed with agonizing slowness. Etienne found himself counting each day, each hour, waiting for the inevitable moment when Christophe Lavaux would return with Marguerite and papers authorizing resale. He tried to maintain his normal routines, processing other sales at Maison Delacroix, reviewing ledgers, supervising his clerks. But his mind remained fixed on the pattern, on the approaching moment when the sequence would reach its 30th iteration. He began researching obsessively, searching for any explanation that would make sense of what he'd documented. He traveled to the Cabildo archives, examining old records from Spanish colonial administration. He visited the St. Louis Cathedral, asking priests about legends or stories that might explain a woman who could be sold repeatedly without aging, without changing, without ever revealing her origins. Father Meunier, an elderly Jesuit who'd served in New Orleans for 40 years, listened to Etienne's carefully worded questions with increasing concern. "You're describing something that exists outside natural law," the priest said finally. "The Church teaches that such things are possible, that God permits both divine intervention and demonic influence in the world. But my son, if you're encountering something supernatural, you must ask yourself a crucial question. Is this evil seeking to destroy, or is this justice manifesting in ways we don't understand?" "I don't know," Etienne admitted. "The men who purchase her are destroyed, their certainties shattered, their peace gone. But they're men who've built fortunes through slavery, who've treated human beings as property without remorse. Is their suffering evil or simply consequence?" "That," Father Meunier said quietly, "is a question that has troubled theologians for centuries. God's justice can feel like punishment to those who've lived comfortably with their sins. And sometimes the most profound mercy is being forced to see truth we've spent our lives avoiding, even when that sight destroys us." On May 30th, exactly 11 days after Narcisse Brutin's purchase, Christophe Lavaux returned to Maison Delacroix. He led Marguerite through the entrance and placed papers on Etienne's desk with the same calm efficiency he'd displayed through 29 previous transactions. "Monsieur Brutin has found her unsuitable," Lavaux said. "He authorizes immediate resale." Etienne examined the documents. Brutin's signature was accompanied by a statement written in handwriting that barely qualified as legible. The words were fractured, sentences incomplete, thoughts cascading without structure. "I calculated profits," the statement began. 32 years as a factor, connected 118 plantations with markets, facilitated sale of sugar produced by, and here the handwriting became almost illegible, countless thousands of enslaved people whose names I never learned, whose faces I never saw, whose suffering I converted into percentages and commission fees, and I never the statement ended mid-sentence, as if Brutin had simply stopped being able to continue. "What did she do to him?" Etienne asked quietly. Lavaux's expression remained neutral. She asked him to calculate the human cost of his wealth, not in abstract terms, but specifically. How many people worked the fields that grew the sugar he brokered? How many died to produce the wealth he took commission from? What were their lives like? Did they have families, children, dreams that died in those fields? She didn't accuse him of wrongdoing. She simply asked him to acknowledge what his business was actually built upon. And that destroyed him. Truth often does, when we've spent our lives avoiding it. Etienne scheduled the 30th auction for June 2nd. He prepared the documentation mechanically, his hands moving through familiar routines while his mind remained elsewhere. 30 sales. The pattern had to be approaching its conclusion, but how many more would there be? And when would it reach him personally? The answer came sooner than he expected. The morning of June 2nd arrived with oppressive heat, the kind of humidity that made breathing feel like drowning. The auction house filled early with buyers and observers, men drawn by rumors of the extraordinary prices being paid, by whispered stories of previous buyers' transformations, by the dark fascination that had surrounded these sales for 5 months. Etienne took his position at the front of the room, opened his ledger to a fresh page, and prepared to begin the auction. But before he could speak, Christophe Lavaux stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the entrance. "Monsieur Delacroix," Lavaux said, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded room, "before we proceed with this sale, I have a proposal to make." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to the factor whose presence had become synonymous with the impossible pattern consuming New Orleans elite. "This sale, the 30th, requires a specific buyer," Lavaux continued. "Someone who has documented every transaction meticulously. Someone who has facilitated these sales while maintaining careful distance from personal responsibility. Someone who has profited from this system while telling himself he's simply a professional conducting business." Ice formed in Etienne's stomach. He knew what was coming, had known for weeks that the pattern would eventually reach him. But hearing it spoken aloud in front of dozens of witnesses made it real in a way that anticipation hadn't. "You're suggesting I purchase her?" Etienne said, keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will. "I'm not suggesting," Lavaux replied. "The pattern requires it. You've watched 29 men go through this process. You've documented their destruction with the same precision you document everything. Now it's your turn to experience what you've been recording." "I'm the auctioneer," Etienne said. "I don't purchase merchandise. I don't have the capital available for these prices." "You have assets," Lavaux said calmly. "This building, your business, your grandfather's reputation. Various banks would extend credit against those holdings. You could arrange financing within 48 hours if you chose." "Why would I choose to do so?" Etienne demanded. "I've watched 29 men purchase her and regret it. I've documented the damage these transactions have caused. I have no desire to become the 30th victim of whatever you've orchestrated." Marguerite spoke for the first time in Etienne's presence since that initial morning in January. Her voice was educated and precise, with an accent that seemed to shift between French, Spanish, and something else entirely. "Because you've spent 15 years facilitating the sale of human beings while maintaining meticulous records that allow you to pretend you're not responsible for the suffering those sales cause. Because you've made your living from systematic cruelty while telling yourself you're just the middleman, that you're not accountable for the system itself. Because you deserve to understand what it actually means to own someone, rather than just processing the paperwork for other men's ownership." Her words struck with devastating accuracy. Etienne had told himself those exact justifications thousands of times. He was just the auctioneer. He didn't own plantations. He didn't work slaves in brutal conditions. He simply facilitated transactions the same way notaries facilitated contracts or banks facilitated loans. He was a professional providing a necessary service. "I won't do it," Etienne said. "I refuse to participate." "Then the pattern ends incomplete," Lavaux replied. "The 37th sale will never occur, and the education will remain unfinished." He paused, letting silence fill the room. "Of course, that means certain information about your business practices might become public. The ages you've falsified in your ledgers to make children appear older. The health conditions you've concealed to present sick slaves as healthy. The specific ways you've helped buyers circumvent laws designed to keep families together. The private arrangements you've made to facilitate sales that violated Louisiana statutes. Every word was accurate. Etienne had bent rules, falsified documentation when necessary, helped buyers work around legal restrictions, all in the name of maintaining his business, all justified as necessary accommodations to commercial reality, nothing that other auction managers didn't do. But exposed to public scrutiny, especially scrutiny from the increasingly influential abolitionist press, those practices would destroy everything his grandfather had built. "You're blackmailing me," Etienne said quietly. "I'm offering you an educational opportunity," Laveau corrected. "You can decline, but declining has consequences, just as participation has consequences. Every choice we make carries weight, Monsieur Delacroix. The question is whether we're willing to face the full implications of our choices." The room remained absolutely silent. Dozens of men watched this confrontation, understanding they were witnessing something that transcended a normal business dispute. This was judgment manifesting in forms that shouldn't exist, justice operating through mechanisms that defied explanation. Etienne looked at Marguerite. She met his gaze without expression, but her eyes held depths that seemed to contain knowledge accumulated over far more than 28 years. Whatever she was, wherever she'd come from, she represented something that existed beyond his understanding, and refusing her would only delay the inevitable confrontation with truths he'd spent 15 years avoiding. 3 days, Etienne said finally. "Give me 3 days to arrange financing." Laveau nodded. "The auction is postponed. We'll reconvene on June 5th at 10 o'clock in the morning." He departed with Marguerite, leaving Etienne alone with the stares of men who now saw him as the latest victim in a pattern they'd watched consume New Orleans' most powerful figures. Those 3 days passed in a blur of financial arrangements that represented the dismantling of everything Etienne had built. He met with bankers who'd known his grandfather, who'd trusted his family for decades. He secured loans against Maison Delacroix itself, against his personal residence, against future earnings from his business. The interest rates were devastating. The repayment terms would require years of careful management. But he arranged the necessary capital. Margot watched him make these arrangements with growing horror. "You're destroying us," she said the night before the auction. "For what? For some woman you're going to own for 11 days and then resell at a massive loss? This makes no sense, Etienne." "I know," he replied, "but refusing makes even less sense. The alternative is having our family's reputation destroyed, having evidence of my compromised business practices made public, having everything grandfather built torn apart through scandal rather than through my own choices." "So you're choosing financial ruin instead?" "I'm choosing to understand something," Etienne said quietly. "Something I should have tried to understand 15 years ago when I first entered this business. What it actually means to participate in this system. What my meticulous record-keeping has actually been documenting all these years." On the morning of June 5th, Etienne stood at the front of Maison de Laqua and conducted an auction where he was the only bidder. The process felt surreal, performing the familiar rituals of his profession while knowing he was purchasing his own destruction. The opening bid, he announced to a room filled with observers who'd come to witness this impossible transaction, is $40,000. "Do I have $40,000? He raised his own hand. $40,000, he said. "Do I hear 45,000? Silence filled the room. "Going once," he continued, following the formula he'd used thousands of times. "Going twice, sold to Etienne Delacroix for $40,000. He signed his own ledger, officially becoming a slave owner for the first time in his life. The irony was acid. 15 years of facilitating ownership for others, of documenting transactions that represented systematic cruelty, and now he was participating directly in the system he'd served. "She'll be at the auction house this evening," Laveau said. "I suggest you arrange for privacy. The education she provides works best without interruption." That night, after his clerks had departed and the building stood empty, Etienne waited in his office. Marguerite arrived exactly at dusk, led by Lavaux, who departed immediately, leaving them alone in the three-story building that represented Etienne's entire professional identity. "Sit down, Monsieur Delacroix," she said. "We have 11 days together. That should be sufficient time to discuss what you've accomplished during your career." She began with simple questions: how he'd entered the auction business, what his first sale had been like, whether he remembered the names of specific individuals he'd sold. The questions seemed conversational at first, the kind of inquiry anyone might make about someone's profession. But gradually, the questions became more specific. She asked about particular transactions. A family of 5 sold separately to different buyers because separating them increased total sale value. An elderly woman sold as healthy when Etienne knew she was dying of consumption. A young girl of perhaps 12 years, whose age he'd recorded as 16 to circumvent laws about selling children. "I have excellent memory," Marguerite said calmly. "I've made it my business to learn about your career, Monsieur Delacroix. Your ledgers are comprehensive, but they don't tell complete stories. Shall we discuss what those transactions actually meant? Not in terms of prices and commission percentages, but in terms of human experience?" And she did discuss them, one by one. She recited names, ages, descriptions. She described families torn apart, children sold away from mothers, elderly slaves disposed of when their productivity declined. She knew details that shouldn't have been accessible to her. Private information from buyer correspondence, from whispered conversations Etienne thought no one had overheard, from records that should have been impossible for her to access. She spoke for hours, her voice never rising, never accusing, simply recounting facts with relentless precision. And as dawn approached, Etienne sat in his chair, no longer maintaining the professional composure he'd prided himself on for 15 years. The accumulation of those facts, the systematic documentation of his complicity in systematic cruelty, stripped away every justification he'd built. "You told yourself you were just facilitating commerce," Marguerite said as first light began filtering through his office windows, "that you weren't responsible for the system, that if you didn't do this work, someone else would. These are the justifications every participant in evil uses. The guard who says he's just following orders, the clerk who says he's just processing forms, the auctioneer who says he's just recording transactions. I didn't create slavery," Etienne said weakly. "I didn't invent this system." "No," she agreed, "but you perfected it. You made it more efficient. You created records so accurate that courts trusted them absolutely, which gave the entire system additional legitimacy. You turned human suffering into neat columns in ledgers, and you profited from it while maintaining the fiction that you were somehow separate from the evil you were facilitating. Your grandfather built this business on blood, and you inherited it without ever questioning what that inheritance actually meant." The 11 days that followed were the longest of Etienne Delacroix's life. Marguerite didn't stop with that first night. Each evening, after his clerks departed and the auction house emptied, she returned to his office and continued the education she'd begun. She recited names, thousands of them. People Etienne had sold over 15 years, individuals he'd reduced to entries in his ledgers, human beings he'd transformed into inventory numbers and price calculations. She knew details about each one, where they'd come from, who they'd been separated from, what had happened to them after he'd facilitated their sale. "A boy named Thomas," she said on the third night, 8 years old when you sold him in October of 1837. His mother begged you not to separate them. She offered to work for reduced price if her buyer would take her son as well. You told her that business didn't work that way, that buyers purchased what they needed, not what slaves wanted. Thomas was sold to a sugar plantation upriver. He died of fever 6 months later. His mother never learned what happened to him. She spent the rest of her life wondering if he was alive somewhere, thinking about her. Etienne felt something crack inside him. "I don't remember that sale specifically. There were so many." Exactly, Marguerite said. There were so many, thousands of human beings whose lives you altered forever, and you don't remember them because you never allowed yourself to see them as people who mattered. They were merchandise, inventory, numbers in your ledgers. Night after night, she continued, she discussed not just the slaves he'd sold, but the buyers he'd served, the planters whose wealth came from brutal labor conditions, the merchants who trafficked in human beings as casually as they traded cotton or sugar, the attorneys who constructed legal frameworks that made slavery seem legitimate, the bankers who financed the whole system, and Etienne himself, the auctioneer who documented everything with such precision that courts treated his records as absolute truth. On the seventh night, she shifted her approach. Instead of reciting names and stories, she asked him questions. If you had been born enslaved, would you consider it just? No, Etienne said immediately. Why not? Because I would have done nothing to deserve that condition. My birth, my ancestry, none of that would justify someone owning me. Then why is it just when it happens to others? Etienne had no answer. Or rather, he had the answers he'd used for 15 years, justifications based on racial theories, biblical interpretations, economic necessities. But speaking them aloud to this woman who'd spent a week systematically dismantling his comfortable certainties felt impossible. Every answer he might give would collapse under the weight of the question itself. You can't justify it, Marguerite said calmly. You know you can't. You've always known. But you've built elaborate structures of rationalization that allowed you to avoid that knowledge. Structures of false science, selective theology, economic determinism. Anything to avoid the simple truth that what you've been participating in for 15 years is evil, not complex evil. Not morally ambiguous evil, just evil. By the 9th night, Etienne had stopped sleeping. He would lie in bed beside Margot, staring at the ceiling, seeing faces, the thousands of people he'd sold, the families he'd separated, the children whose ages he'd falsified, the sick slaves he'd presented as healthy, the human beings he'd reduced to merchandise and processed with efficient precision. His hands had begun shaking, not constantly, but often enough that his clerks noticed. He made errors in his ledgers, mistakes he never would have made before. A transposed date, a misspelled name, small failures that suggested his famous precision was crumbling. On the 10th night, Marguerite asked him the question he'd been dreading. If you could go back 15 years, knowing what you know now, would you still enter this business? No, Etienne said immediately. Then quieter, but I didn't know then what I know now. You chose not to know, she corrected. The knowledge was available, the suffering was visible. You saw it every day in your auction house, people weeping as they were separated from families, children terrified of being sold, elderly slaves knowing they were being disposed of because they were no longer profitable. You saw all of it. You just chose to interpret it as normal business operations rather than systematic cruelty. What was I supposed to do? Etienne asked, and heard the desperation in his own voice. Refuse to participate? That wouldn't have stopped the system. Someone else would have run this auction house. Slaves would still have been sold. Perhaps, Marguerite said, but you wouldn't have been the one selling them. You wouldn't have profited from their suffering. You wouldn't have created the meticulous records that gave the entire system additional legitimacy. You're right that individual refusal wouldn't have ended slavery, but it would have meant you weren't complicit in it. And sometimes, that's all morality requires. Not that we fix everything, but that we don't participate in evil, even when participation is profitable and refusal is costly. On the 11th morning, June 16th, Marguerite spoke to him one final time before the pattern would complete. You'll authorize my resale today, she said. You'll take whatever loss is necessary to be rid of me. And then you'll spend the rest of your life knowing exactly what you were complicit in. That knowledge will never leave you. Every time you close your eyes, you'll see their faces. Every time you open your ledgers, you'll understand what those neat columns of numbers actually represent. I've made certain of that. What are you? Etienne asked. the question he'd been avoiding for 11 days because he feared the answer. "How is any of this possible?" "Does it matter?" Marguerite replied. "Whether I'm exactly what I appear to be, a woman who's been sold 30 times by men who found truth unbearable, or something else entirely, the facts remain the same. You've spent 15 years as an instrument of systematic cruelty. That truth doesn't change regardless of my nature. Will this end? Will the pattern stop?" "Soon," she said. 7 more sales remain. 37 total. A number with significance you'd understand if you studied theology more carefully than you've studied your ledgers. And then it will be finished. 7 more men will be destroyed? 7 more men will learn what they've chosen to ignore, Marguerite corrected. Destruction is simply how it feels when comfortable lies become impossible to maintain. That afternoon, Etienne authorized her resale. Christophe Laveau accepted the documentation without comment, preparing for the 31st transaction. Etienne recorded the loss in his ledgers with hands that shook despite his efforts to control them. $40,000 spent. Perhaps $20,000 recoverable if the next buyer paid well. $20,000 lost for 11 days of education that had destroyed his peace forever. But the financial loss was trivial compared to what Marguerite had actually taken from him, his certainty, his comfortable participation in systems he'd never examined, his ability to process human suffering as normal business operations. All of it gone, stripped away, leaving only understanding that felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. The remaining 7 sales proceeded with the same mechanical precision that had characterized the previous 30. Every 11 days, Marguerite returned to auction at Maison Delacroix. Every 11 days, another prominent man purchased her for escalating prices. And every 11 days later, that man authorized resale, broken by whatever education she'd provided. The 31st buyer was Jean-Jacques Audubon's patron, a wealthy merchant who'd financed the naturalist's expeditions. He emerged from his 11 days, unable to look at his account books, unable to calculate profit, unable to participate in commerce that treated human beings as commodities. The 32nd buyer was a prominent Catholic who defended slavery through biblical interpretation. He freed every slave he owned after his 11 days and spent the rest of his life as a hermit, unable to reconcile his previous certainties with what he now understood. The 33rd buyer was a riverboat captain who'd transported thousands of slaves upriver to plantations. He sold his boats and left Louisiana entirely, unable to continue his business after understanding what his cargo had actually been. Not property, but people whose suffering he'd facilitated for profit. By the 35th sale in late July, New Orleans society had begun to fracture under the weight of the pattern. Too many prominent men had been affected. Too many families disrupted, too many fortunes damaged. Whispers circulated about curses and divine judgment, about God's punishment for the city's sins, about supernatural forces manifesting to destroy slavery's defenders. The church began to take notice. Archbishop Antoine Blanc called a private meeting with several affected men, attempting to understand what was happening. But those who'd purchased Marguerite couldn't explain. How do you tell a bishop that you bought a slave who educated you about your own evil? How do you admit that truth destroyed your capacity to participate in systems you'd defended? Etienne attended that meeting, invited because of his comprehensive documentation of the sales. He sat quietly while other men struggled to articulate their experiences. When Archbishop Blanc finally asked him directly what he believed was happening, Etienne answered with careful precision. "Your Excellency, I believe we're witnessing judgment, not supernatural, not divine intervention in ways that violate natural law, simply consequence manifesting. These men, myself included, have built wealth through systematic cruelty while maintaining comfortable distance from the reality of what we were doing. Someone, or something, has removed that distance. Forced us to confront truth we've spent our lives avoiding, and confronting that truth has destroyed our ability to continue participating in evil while telling ourselves we're not responsible for it." "And you believe this is just?" the archbishop asked, "that men should be destroyed this way?" "I believe," Etienne said slowly, "that participating in slavery destroys something in us, makes us capable of treating human beings as property, of calculating the monetary value of children, of separating families for profit. What's happening now isn't destruction, it's revelation. We're finally seeing what we've always been. And seeing that clearly is unbearable." The 36th sale occurred on August 9th. The buyer was Laurent Milardon, one of New Orleans' wealthiest bankers, a man whose financial operations had funded plantation purchases across Louisiana. He paid $63,000, the highest price yet recorded in Etienne's ledgers. 11 days later, Christophe Laveau returned with authorization for the final sale. Etienne looked at the papers with a mixture of relief and dread. 37 sales. The pattern was approaching completion. But who would be the final buyer? What made that particular transaction the ending point? The answer came on August 23rd, when the auction house filled with a crowd larger than any previous sale. Men who'd attended sporadically throughout the 5-month sequence now appeared with the understanding that they were witnessing something historically significant. This would be the final transaction in a pattern that had consumed New Orleans' elite for months. Etienne took his position at the front of the room. Before he could begin, Christophe Laveau stepped forward. "This final sale," Laveau said, his voice carrying through the crowded room, "requires someone who represents the culmination of this education, someone whose position embodies everything this system has created. Someone whose family has defended slavery not just through ownership, but through political power, legal philosophy, and the construction of moral justifications that have poisoned generations." The room's atmosphere shifted. Men looked around, trying to determine who Laveau was describing. Then the door opened, and everyone understood. Judah P. Benjamin entered Maison Delacroix with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the most intelligent person in any room. At 39 years old, he'd already established himself as one of Louisiana's most brilliant attorneys and rising political figures. He would later serve as Secretary of State for the Confederacy, but in August of 1840, he was simply a lawyer whose legal arguments defending slavery were considered intellectually unassailable. Benjamin surveyed the room, his expression calculating. He'd heard about the pattern, about the impossible sales and the destruction of buyers, but he'd also studied the documentation, examined the legal framework, and concluded that whatever was happening operated within natural law. And if it operated within natural law, it could be understood, controlled, and ultimately mastered through superior intellect. "Shall we proceed?" Benjamin asked, his tone suggesting amusement at the dramatic atmosphere. The bidding opened at $50,000. Benjamin raised his hand immediately. "60,000, he said calmly. No one else bid. The room understood that Benjamin had claimed this purchase, that challenging him would be futile. He possessed wealth sufficient to outbid anyone present, and more importantly, he possessed certainty that he would be different from previous buyers. "Going once," Etienne said, following the familiar formula. "Going twice, sold to Judah P. Benjamin for $60,000. Benjamin signed the papers with a flourish. His signature was bold and confident, the handwriting of someone who'd never doubted himself. "Have her delivered to my residence this evening," he said. "I'm curious to experience whatever education destroyed lesser men." That evening, Marguerite was transported to Benjamin's home on Bourbon Street. And for 11 days, New Orleans waited to see if its most brilliant legal mind could withstand what 36 other men hadn't. Jacques Reynaud, the investigator who'd been tracking the pattern since April, managed to place an informant in Benjamin's household. A free man of color who worked as Benjamin's cook and who agreed to report on what he observed. The reports were fragmentary but revealing. Benjamin and Marguerite spent hours in his private library. Raised voices could be heard occasionally, not anger, but intense intellectual debate. Papers rustled as Benjamin pulled books from shelves, constructing arguments, citing legal precedent, building philosophical frameworks. And Marguerite's voice, calm and relentless, dismantling every argument with questions that expose their logical foundations as elaborate rationalizations. On the fourth day, the cook reported that Benjamin had stopped eating. On the sixth day, he'd sent his household staff away, insisting he needed complete privacy. On the eighth day, neighbors reported seeing Benjamin pacing his balcony at 3 o'clock in the morning, talking to himself, his hands gesturing as if arguing with invisible opponents. On the 11th morning, September 3rd, Benjamin emerged from his residence looking like he'd aged 20 years. He went directly to Maison de Laqua, where Etienne waited with the documentation for Marguerite's resale authorization. "She must be removed immediately," Benjamin said. His voice, usually commanding and precise, sounded hollow. "I cannot. The things she knows, the arguments she makes. I've spent my entire career constructing legal and philosophical justifications for slavery. I've built what I believed was an intellectually unassailable position, and she's shown me with perfect logical clarity that every argument collapses. Every justification is simply sophisticated self-deception. Every philosophical framework I've constructed is designed to let me profit from evil while telling myself I'm engaged in something morally defensible." He signed the authorization with shaking hands. Then he looked at Etienne directly. "You've documented all of this. 37 sales. Do you understand what we've actually been recording? Not business transactions, confessions, evidence of systematic evil documented with such precision that future generations will be able to see exactly what we were, exactly what we chose to participate in, exactly how we rationalized the irrational." Etienne accepted the papers. "The 37th sale," he said quietly. "The pattern is complete." Benjamin nodded slowly. "She told me it would end now, that 37 men would learn what they'd chosen to ignore, and then she would be finished. Whatever she is, wherever she came from, her purpose here is complete." "What will you do now?" Etienne asked. Benjamin laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "What can I do? I can't unknow what I've learned. Can't unsee what she's made me see. I'll continue my career because I have no other skills. But every legal argument I make will feel like complicity. Every case I take will remind me of the truth I can't escape. She's destroyed my ability to participate in this system without understanding exactly what I'm participating in. And that understanding will torture me until I die." He departed, leaving Etienne alone with Christophe Laveau and Marguerite. "It's finished then?" Etienne asked. Laveau nodded. 37 men have been educated. 37 prominent figures who built wealth and power through slavery have been forced to confront what they were doing. The pattern is complete. What happens to her now? "Watch," Laveau said simply. Marguerite stood in the center of Maison Delacroix's main auction room, the space where thousands of human beings had been sold over decades, where Etienne's grandfather had built a business on systematic cruelty, where Etienne himself had spent 15 years processing human suffering as normal commerce. She looked directly at Etienne. "You'll want to document this final moment," she said. "Your ledgers should be complete." And then, before Etienne's eyes, she began to change, not dramatically, not through visible transformation, but through a gradual fading, as if she were becoming less substantial, less present, less real. Within moments she had vanished entirely, leaving only empty space where she'd been standing. Christophe Laveau smiled slightly. "The education is complete," he said. 37 men have learned truths that will haunt them forever, and the evidence of what happened will remain in your ledgers, Monsieur Delacroix, documented with the precision you're famous for. Future generations will be able to see exactly what occurred here, exactly what slavery required of those who participated in it, exactly what happened when those people were forced to confront the reality of their choices. He turned toward the door. "I suggest you preserve those records carefully. They're historically significant." "Wait," Etienne called. "What was she? Where did she come from?" Laveau paused in the doorway. "Does it matter? She was exactly what New Orleans needed, a mirror that couldn't be avoided, truth that couldn't be rationalized away. justice manifesting in the only form that men of wealth and power would actually experience, not as physical punishment, but as forced understanding of their own evil. Whether she was human, angel, demon, or something else entirely is less important than what she accomplished. "And you?" Etienne asked. "What are you?" "Someone who facilitates necessary transactions," Laveau replied. "Just like you've been for 15 years. The difference is that I facilitate education rather than commerce, and unlike you, I don't pretend my facilitation isn't profoundly meaningful." He departed, and Etienne never saw him again. The aftermath unfolded slowly over the following months. The 37 men who'd purchased Marguerite were permanently changed. Some freed their slaves and withdrew from society. Others continued their previous lives, but did so with visible suffering, unable to escape the knowledge she'd given them. Several died within years, their health destroyed by psychological torment they couldn't articulate or escape. Judah P. Benjamin continued his legal career and eventually rose to prominence in the Confederacy. But those who knew him well noticed changes. His arguments defending slavery became less frequent, his public statements more careful. And in private moments he was observed staring at nothing, his expression suggesting someone engaged in internal debate that never concluded. Etienne himself continued managing Maison de Laqua, but the work became increasingly unbearable. Every sale reminded him of the thousands he'd processed before Marguerite forced him to understand what those transactions actually represented. His famous precision deteriorated. He made errors his clerks had to correct. His health declined despite no specific illness physicians could identify. In 1843, he sold Maison Delacroix to a competitor and moved his family to Mobile, Alabama, attempting to escape the memories that haunted him in New Orleans. But the memories followed. The faces of people he'd sold, the families he'd separated, the comfortable lies he'd told himself for 15 years. He attempted multiple times to write a comprehensive account of what had happened during those 5 months in 1840. Stacks of incomplete manuscripts accumulated, each trying to explain the impossible sequence of events, each abandoned as inadequate. His final attempt, written in 1856, began, "I have spent 16 years trying to understand what happened during those months. Whether Marguerite was exactly what she appeared to be, an extraordinarily educated woman who somehow gained power over New Orleans' elite, or something beyond human comprehension, remains unclear. What is certain is that 37 men, myself included, learned truths about ourselves that destroyed our peace permanently. We were educated about complicity, about the specific ways we'd chosen to profit from systematic cruelty while maintaining comfortable self-images. That education was more destructive than any physical punishment could have been." The manuscript ended mid-sentence. Etienne died of heart failure in 1857 at age 53, his final words reportedly being names, dozens of names. People he'd sold decades earlier, their identities flooding back in his final moments. His ledgers from Maison Delacroix survived him. The new owner maintained them as valuable business records, and they eventually passed to the Louisiana State Archives. But when archivists catalogued them in 1898, they noticed the anomalous entries from 1840, 37 sales of the same woman over 5 months, prices that defied economic logic. Buyers, including some of Louisiana's most prominent historical figures, concerned about how these records might be interpreted, particularly by northern publications still processing Reconstruction's aftermath, officials quietly restricted access. The ledgers were placed in special archives, requiring gubernatorial approval that was rarely granted and eventually became impossible to obtain as bureaucratic procedures calcified around the restriction. Researchers who stumble across references to the pattern in peripheral documents find their access requests denied without explanation. The official position, when pressed, suggests clerical errors or confusion between similar individuals. But Etienne Delacroix built his reputation on precision. His records show no evidence of the sloppy record-keeping that would produce such fundamental mistakes. What remains are whispers and fragments, a mention in a private letter from 1842 describing the strange woman who was sold repeatedly in New Orleans, a notation in a plantation ledger referencing purchased property that brought unbearable knowledge, a diary entry from a prominent attorney's wife describing her husband's descent into depression after acquiring a slave who asked questions that destroyed his certainty about everything he believed. The truth sits sealed in Louisiana's archives, pages of meticulous documentation showing that for 5 months in 1840 something manifested in New Orleans that shouldn't have been possible. A woman who was sold 37 times. Conversations that lasted 11 days and destroyed men's ability to participate in evil with comfortable distance. Justice taking forms that transcended normal human experience. Some scholars who've investigated the edges of this story suggest explanations. Perhaps Marguerite was an extraordinarily educated free woman of color who was illegally enslaved and found ways to psychologically manipulate her buyers into releasing her. Perhaps the pattern was coincidence, multiple women confused in records, clerical errors that created the appearance of impossibility. But these explanations collapse under examination. Free women of color in New Orleans maintained documented lives, birth records, property holdings, family connections. Marguerite appears in no records before January of 1840 and vanishes from all documentation after September 3rd. No birth certificate, no death certificate, no property purchases, no family connections, nothing that would track an actual human being through the 19th century. And the precision of the pattern defies coincidence. Exactly 11 days between every sale without exception, exactly 37 transactions before the pattern ended. Prices that climbed with mathematical regularity, and 37 prominent men, each representing different aspects of slavery's operation, all experiencing similar transformations after their 11 days of ownership. The simplest explanation, and the most disturbing, is that events occurred exactly as documented. That, for 5 months in 1840, 37 men who profited from slavery were forced to truly understand what they were participating in. That education destroyed them more thoroughly than any violence could have. And that, somewhere in Louisiana's restricted archives, lies proof that sometimes justice manifests in forms we can barely comprehend, operating through mechanisms that defy our categories while leaving evidence documented with precision that can't be dismissed. What happened to Marguerite after she faded from existence in Maison de Laqua? Did she move to another city, another auction house, to educate another group of men who needed to understand the truth of their choices? Or did she simply cease to exist once her purpose in New Orleans was complete? The archives remain sealed. The pages documenting those 37 sales sit behind bureaucratic barriers that have become absolute through decades of calcification. And if you ask historians who specialize in antebellum Louisiana about the impossible pattern from 1840, most will tell you that no such documentation exists in accessible collections. But among serious scholars, questions persist. How could one woman be sold 37 times in 5 months? How could impossible documentation pass legal scrutiny from trained professionals whose careers depended on accuracy? What actually happened during those 11-day periods that transformed powerful men into broken shells of their former selves? And why does Louisiana's government continue restricting access to records that are now more than a century and a half old? The answers exist. They're documented with the meticulous precision that Maison Delacroix was famous for. Every sale recorded, every buyer identified, every price documented, every consequence catalogued. The evidence sits waiting for someone with sufficient authority and courage to demand access, waiting to reveal that in 1840, New Orleans experienced something that shouldn't have been possible. That justice sometimes takes forms we don't expect. That truth, when it can't be avoided, destroys comfortable lies more thoroughly than any weapon. And that, somewhere in those sealed archives, lies documentation of the most coveted slave ever auctioned in New Orleans, a woman who was purchased 37 times, who educated 37 men about the evil they participated in, who destroyed their peace by forcing them to see clearly what they'd spent their lives avoiding, and who vanished the moment her purpose was complete, leaving only questions that Louisiana's authorities have spent more than a century refusing to answer. What do you believe happened in New Orleans during those 5 months? Was Marguerite exactly what she appeared to be, or something that exists beyond our understanding? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story gave you something to think about, subscribe to The Sealed Room and turn on notifications so you never miss these buried chapters of American history. Share this with someone who appreciates dark truths that institutions tried to erase. And I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another secret that powerful people spent generations trying to keep hidden.